Bolivar was born rich, a playboy that gave up his life full of privilege to fight the Spanish Empire. To see why and how that happened, join me for this brief look at the life and times of Simón Bolivar. Simón Antonio de la Santísima Trinidad Bolívar y Palacios was born July 24, 1783, just 4 years before the first aborted rebellion in Caracas. The revolt was in reaction to the monarchist struggles in Europe, to oppressive policies that kept Spanish-born in the Americas, that is criollos, from managing their own affairs, to the frustration of having to read Enlightenment ideas in banned books. Bolivar, the youngest of 4 children born to one of the most aristocratic families of the New World, was of that generation that finally tired of the oppressive practices of the Spanish crown. His ancestors through 2 centuries had been richly rewarded for service and loyalty in administering the orders of the monarch, helping build the port of La Guaira, laying roads, digging mines, and creating plantations. But rather than profit from this system, Bolivar followed a more tortuous path. He was orphaned early in life. Although precise dates vary, it seems certain his father died when Bolivar was very young, and his mother before he had reached his middle teens. Nevertheless, Bolivar led what one biographer called a spoiled and precocious boyhood, as a result of his family's wealth and the devoted attentions of enslaved women. Equally attentive were his tutors, including Andrés Bello, who would become a noted diplomat, scientist, and humanist, as well as Simón Rodriguez, a young devotee of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rodriguez began his lessons about the time Bolivar's mother died, and Bolivar later recognized how much this influenced his life. The relationship had its fullest effect for 5 years, and after Rodriguez returned to Europe, Bolivar sought him out. Thus, Bolivar was both protected by great wealth and schooled from childhood in revolutionary notions. Bolivar's training also included athletics, and in about 1797, when he was 14, he was given military training for 2 years. He rose to the rank of lieutenant. When he was 16, he was sent to Madrid to live with relatives and get further schooling. As a wealthy Creole, he was introduced to people in the most privileged positions of the system he would later help destroy. In 1800, at the age of 17, Bolivar met María Teresa Rodríguez del Toro, a few years his elder, the niece of a Caracas merchant. Of their meeting, no biographer fails to note Bolivar's immediate and profound infatuation. Impatiently, he waited 2 years before he could marry her and take her home, but within 10 months of their arrival back in Caracas, in the tropical climate to which she was not accustomed, she was dead of yellow fever. Her death was crushing. 6 months after she died, Bolivar, restless and disconsolate, was back in Europe. He later wrote, explaining his single-mindedness, "The death of my wife pushed me very early into politics." He would never remarry. On this trip, Bolivar traveled to Paris, where in the spring of 1804, he found Napoleon, whom he admired, undermining republicanism by crowning himself. That Bonaparte would aspire to be a Caesar disappointed Bolivar, although he recognized the need for structure that was represented by Napoleonic law. The pomp of Napoleon's Paris also impressed Bolivar. He never lost his sense of wonder at the way cheering crowds sounded and would reconstruct the sensation again and again. In Paris, Bolivar was directed to the eminent German naturalist, Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt, it is said, told Bolivar that a recent trip to Mexico had convinced him that the natural wealth of Latin America promised its peoples a great future if a man dared lead them. In 1805, Bolivar went to Vienna to visit his old tutor, Rodriguez, with whom he set out on a walking trip to Rome. While there, Bolivar took Rodriguez to the top of Mount Aventino, where he swore to God he would never rest until his homeland was independent. After continuing on to Naples and spending more time with Humboldt, Bolivar in 1806 went on to the United States. He traveled from Boston to New York, Philadelphia, the District of Columbia, and Charleston, observing the nation with its brand new constitution. All this time, tremors of independence were being felt from Mexico to Argentina, and Bolivar saw the United States as the model for a united Latin America. In 1810, after Bolivar had returned, Caracas cast its die. On April 19th, the town council declared allegiance to the deposed Ferdinand VII of Spain, rather than the king placed on the throne by Napoleon and represented in Caracas by a Spanish captain general. Ferdinand's restoration to the throne, of course, was but a convenient cause. It came too late if it was to be followed by restoration of the colonial system in America. Political freedom, and the commercial advantages it held, was not like some dried flower to be saved between the pages of a book. For the group of independentistas who Bolivar was now leading, at age 26, any monarchy represented oppression. In the summer of 1811, Venezuela declared its independence. The revolutionary junta sent Bolivar to Great Britain to solicit aid, and he was instrumental in bringing back to Venezuela the elderly Francisco de Miranda, a colorful character who had long advocated freedom from the crown. Under Miranda's erratic leadership, armies of criollos were at first successful. Then, human frailty and natural disaster combined to cloud the picture. First, Miranda came to consider himself a virtual dictator, rendering himself as unpopular in some circles of the New World as he was with the crown. Second, earthquakes struck. There were two severe tremors. The first was on March 26, 1812, a Maundy Thursday when churches were full. Entire towns were leveled, corpses of troops were buried. 10,000 people were said to have been killed in Caracas alone. Royalists shouted that it was the dissident towns that most suffered God's wrath for their opposition to the divine right of Ferdinand. They pointed to a Caracas church that bore the royal coat of arms in one of its pillars and was completely leveled, except for that pillar. Surely a sign, the royalists averred, angrily roaming the streets. Then on April 4th, another quake struck. Bolivar too took to the streets, arguing against the doomsayers and helping to dig out corpses. Rebel determination, however, was shaken. Military setbacks followed with the result that rebel ranks were broken. In June, the rebel army was devastated in battle, and Miranda tried to flee. He was caught and turned over to the Spanish by Bolivar and other officers and gentlemen, whom the Spanish, in return for the favor, allowed to go into exile. The treachery was excused by Bolivar and his brother officers as justified in light of Miranda's successes. Miranda would eventually die in a Spanish dungeon, but if honor was sullied, the rebellion's leadership was preserved. Bolivar fled first to safety on the island of Curaçao. From there, he returned to the northern coast of Colombia, where he issued the Declaration of Cartagena. Talking to his compatriots, he made clear the Spanish were not superior. If they appear great to us, he said, it is because we are on our knees. Let us avenge 3 centuries of shame. This proved enough for Bolivar to be able to gather about 200 men for his cause, whom he led overland back into Venezuela. At Caracas, the resident criollos declared him liberator and dictator, but the Spanish once again drove him out. In exile again, this time in Jamaica, Bolivar was protected but not assisted by the British, who were somewhat ambivalent about his intentions. Recognizing this, Bolivar argued that their long-term interests lay with eschewing support for old European monarchies and supporting New World rebellion. Europe itself, by reason of wholesome policies, Bolivar wrote in 1815, should have prepared and carried out the plan of American independence, not only because it is so required for the balance of the world, but because this is a legitimate and safe means of obtaining commercial posts. Trying once more to return to the mainland, Bolivar was again chased out by royalist troops, this time to Haiti. There he was more warmly welcomed than he had been by the British, and he was able to get assistance from a government run by former slaves. This new Haitian government, so feared in Europe and the United States for the example it set, formed an immediate alliance with Bolivar, and Bolivarian constitutions would all have a provision prohibiting slavery. Bolivar again gathered an officer corps. His ability to continually recruit Patriot armies suggests the attractiveness of his personality and the degree of his commitment. Bolivar, who had made himself into an army commander through sheer force of character and strength of will, never forgot his own men, and for that they adored him. With his nascent army, he landed again in the spring of 1816 on the coast of Venezuela. As he had promised, his first official act was to abolish slavery. The people hailed him. Again, they declared him liberator, but they did not join his army. And so, for a third time, royalists chased him out. Finally, in 1817, Bolivar was successful in making his return trip stick because he allied himself with an early practitioner of guerrilla warfare, José Antonio Páez. Unable to beat disciplined royalist troops in open battle, Bolivar needed time to build an army. By joining forces with Páez, whose rough, illiterate frontiersmen were extremely efficient fighters, he got that time and much more besides. Páez, in fact, is directly responsible for the successful beginning of the Wars of Independence. Páez recruited peasants, many of whom had at first fought on the royalist side as mercenaries, and turned them into a feared division of the Patriot army. Bolstered by Páez's men and instructed by his tactics, Bolivar stopped trying to march on cities and instead lived off the bounty of the countryside, keeping his own troops provisioned while denying supplies to the enemy. Tactics ceased being attack and retreat and were stretched into an effort at outlasting the royalists. Its legitimacy growing with every day and able to stay in the field, the army further benefited from thousands of mercenaries who began arriving from Britain and Germany. Under Bolivar's command, this reinvigorated army secured part of Venezuela but avoided the strong Spanish force there and turned toward Nueva Granada, which was not as stoutly defended. In the spring of 1819, Bolivar led a Patriot force of more than 2,000 men, roughly 1,300 infantry and 700 cavalry, through the Orinoco jungles during the rainy season and up into the frozen passages of the Andes, which lay across his path to Nueva Granada. A portion of this army was recent European immigrants, some of whom had seen action in the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, there was a full battalion of British troops. Leadership was also young. Bolivar was the oldest at 36. Francisco de Paula Santander, leading the forward contingent, was only 28. At Paya in late June, the Patriots defeated a strong Spanish position and began their ascent through the Andes. When they passed 10,000 feet, the tree line was below them, and they passed over narrow, treacherous, slippery trails, often in fog, beneath peaks that reached 14,000 feet. Men of the lowlands, they had never experienced such bitter cold. Many died of exposure, including 56 of the English, and when the rest reached Socha on July 6, 1819, they had practically nothing but their weapons. All the pack and saddle animals had died on the way. With this army, Bolivar won 3 engagements in the middle of July against well-trained troops holding good positions. Then, with the Spanish rocked back on their heels, Bolivar pursued his advantage to a final victory at the Battle of Boyacá. The viceroy fled from Bogotá, and Bolivar rode, almost completely unattended, into the city in complete victory. It was a turning point. From then on, most of Bolivar's campaigns would be very swift and quite successful. Once control of New Granada was assured, Bolivar was proclaimed liberator, but before the year was out, he had to hurry back to Venezuela because officers and civilian politicians were plotting against him. It was a scene that would be repeated again and again. The Spanish could be defeated, but the Criollos could not conquer their wrangling for power or control their predilection for divisiveness. Bolivar's plans were enhanced by events in Spain. In Cádiz, the great army being prepared for embarkation revolted on New Year's Day, 1820. The Spanish were politically divided between supporters of the monarchy and adherents of the idea embodied in the Constitution of 1812 of a constitutional system. The army, influenced by constitutionalists, declared itself more interested in staying home than mounting an expedition to reconquer the colonies. Although Bolivar still faced at least 15,000 royalist troops in Nueva Granada and royal garrisons in major cities, his task was considerably eased. The commander of royalist forces in Nueva Granada, General Pablo Morillo, was ordered to negotiate. Reluctantly, he agreed, and during 1820, the war in the north dwindled into discussion between equals. Relations between the two sides deteriorated, however, when Morillo was recalled to Spain. The armistice was ended, and after 2 inconclusive engagements in the spring of 1821, the situation in the north moved towards its final resolution during the summer. It was the second great battle fought on the plain of Carabobo, south of Caracas, where Bolivar had won one of its early victories 7 years before. This time, Bolivar confronted approximately 5,000 skilled enemy troops in a strong position with a slightly bigger army. In the end, after a long day of fighting, Bolivar led a frontal attack, causing huge royalist losses in dead, wounded, and captured. The Spanish commander was chased with his few remaining troops to refuge in Puerto Cabello. Within days, the Caracas garrison surrendered. The war in the north was essentially over. The time, July 1821, had come for Bolivar and San Martin, who had just conquered Lima, to meet. The two had corresponded as their armies approached each other. San Martin had sent troops to help bring order to Ecuador's periodic madness, and now Bolivar was in Guayaquil trying to calm the excitable citizens of that city. Logically, the meeting should have paved the way for joint action, but that is not what happened. These were not logical times. San Martin unexpectedly requested the meeting and sailed northward from Callao. He wanted to get reinforcements for his army and to decide the proper government for Guayaquil, which was being pulled apart by forces favoring Peru, Colombia, or its own independent government. San Martin was also willing to discuss the idea of some form of constitutional monarchy for new Latin American countries, perhaps imposing European princes for the purpose. He had been, after all, thoroughly chastened by his experiences in Chile and Peru. He was unable to point to any example of stable government and was uncertain whether any was possible under a republican form. Bolivar, on the other hand, approached the meeting transfixed by his own grand idea to create Gran Colombia out of New Granada, modern Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, and to weld a union of Latin American states that would be a model of strength against aggression from outside and of cooperation inside. He had reluctantly accepted the presidency of Gran Colombia from a Congress assembled at Cúcuta. "I'm not the kind of ruler the Republic wants," he said, and left Santander in charge of civic affairs while he journeyed southward to try to complete the war. Despite sniping by local politicians and nationalist fervor that would soon break his union into pieces, Bolivar in mid-1821 stood head and shoulders above any alternative in Latin America. As if to press home this point, when San Martin stepped ashore at Guayaquil, Bolivar welcomed him to Colombian soil. The two men conferred in private without even aides accompanying them. History, as a result, does not record precisely what was said. Meanwhile, just as this was happening, word of an uprising in Lima, of which San Martin was unaware, arrived. It had erupted as soon as the protector left the city. The news must have confirmed everything San Martin had come to believe about the impossibility of stable government. 3 days after his arrival, San Martin, disgusted with failure and apparently embarrassed, quickly and quietly left Guayaquil, sailed to Peru, resigned as protector, went to Chile, and traveled overland to Buenos Aires and then sailed to Europe. He left, as it turned out, the remaining heartache to Bolivar. The problem of clearing Peru of royalist troops remained. Bolivar sent a Colombian force for that purpose, but it was sent back, either because of Peruvian ingratitude or Colombian arrogance. It was difficult to tell with Peruvians who tended to cover royalist sentiments with the thinnest of Republican veneers. Whatever the reason, in early 1823, Bolivar sent the troops again, this time with Sucre at their head. Then Bolivar himself, at the insistence of Peruvians, went south, still looking for the last great battle and determined not to slip into the bog of civil administration. The Battle of Junín on August 7, 1823, was a fitting last battle for the Liberator. Called the Battle of the Centaurs because it was fought entirely by cavalry with swords and lances, it ended as a complete Patriot victory. The Royalists retreated south, where after Bolivar had returned to Lima, General Antonio José de Sucre destroyed them on December 9, 1824, in the Battle of Ayacucho. When the news of Ayacucho reached Bolivar, he ripped off his uniform jacket and threw it on the ground, saying, "Thank God, never again shall I have to command." For 8 months in 1825, Bolivar traveled through Upper Peru, the area which would later become the country named after him, Bolivia. His last government effort was to write the constitution for the new nation, which showed his concern for a stable republican government. Notably, the only thing the new republic rejected was Bolivar's provision for freedom of religion. More serious differences of opinion awaited him back in Colombia in 1826, where internal disputes and bankruptcy threatened. But the story was the same in every new republic. His presence seemed necessary everywhere to inspire that loyalty and common sense without which his schemes would not work. Guayaquil and Quito left the Union, and in January 1827, Bolivar returned to Venezuela, disenchanted and unable to live up to his requirements. Bolivar rode into Caracas accompanied by Páez, but Páez was a dissident too. Bolivar spent 6 months trying to reorganize the government, working on agriculture and education, and worrying over the budget. His thanks for his effort was a resolution asking that he never return to his native country. He returned to Bogotá, to Manuela Sáenz, the mistress who had been among his few devoted followers. Santander privately accused him of ruling not constitutionally but capriciously, and indeed, Bolivar's mind was addled. His orders were often contradictory. Tuberculosis racked his body, and ingratitude was destroying his mind. His behavior only contributed to the widespread confusion. At the same time that opponents were trying to hound him into exile, several town councils were declaring him dictator for life. If Bolivar was without direction, so was everyone else. The attempt on his life in 1828 was the final disgrace. Saved by Manuela Sáenz, Bolivar hid beneath a bridge through most of the night, damaging his health and honor. The coup was never actively overtly supported by more than a battalion of troops and a few officers, but it was clear that many more hung back, hoping for the attempt to succeed. Santander was at the root of it and was at first condemned to death, although Bolivar commuted the sentence to exile. Still, he found himself condemning to firing squads men like José María Córdoba, who had been brave soldiers throughout the wars of independence. He despaired. Finally, the charge of being a monarchist was leveled at Bolivar. After sacrificing his physical and mental health for the cause of democracy, Bolivar was now subject to the same accusation that had been aimed at San Martín. The strain showed on Bolivar. In January 1830, returning to Bogotá from a trip, Bolivar tried to find peaceful exile. Bolivar was described as ghastly pale. His voice was almost inaudible. Addressing the Colombian Congress, he said, "Fellow citizens, I am ashamed to say it, but independence is the sole benefit we have gained at the sacrifice of all others." In the spring, even as New Granada and Ecuador pulled apart, Bolivar tried to find peaceful exile, as his health had been ravaged by tuberculosis. He rode off, accompanied by his longtime servant José Palacios and only a few others, seeking refuge on the northern coast of Colombia, the northern edge of what he had envisioned as a great political union. Although General Rafael Urdaneta, encouraged and aided by Manuela Sáenz, was successful in briefly leading pro-Bolivar forces back to power, Bolivar himself refused to return. He knew it would lead to bloody civil war. Bolivar stayed to die. "To the sepulchre, that's what my fellow citizens have meted out for me," he told the French doctor attending him. "But I forgive them. I only wish I could take with me the consolation of their having stayed together." He received, when he was not too weak to see them, a scattering of visitors, including one sent by Manuela Sáenz, because he had not allowed her to accompany him. "Prepare yourself to receive the final and fatal news," she was informed in the winter of 1830. And so it happened. As Bolivar finally succumbed on December 17th, the man was 47 years old.